Okay, this is CYBR 4220. This is Vulnerability Assessment by Kevin Burnside. This is our last presentation. I'm going ahead and apologize from the get-go. My voice is kind of shot. I'm actually locked in my room waiting on COVID test results. I think it's just a cold though. But if there's an issue with my voice, I can only do this so many times, so I apologize. Other than that, let's get started. Okay, so my partner slash target for my vulnerability assessment was one of the people in my group. I'm just going to use initials DS for privacy. And I'm going to be going over in this presentation executive summary, the required services that were supposed to be there, app armor, and IP tables, a quick review of that. Just so we're up on speed. Fixes for identified vulnerabilities. I'll be bring up what the vulnerabilities were in the executive summary, so I'm not going to rehash them in the technical summary and then go rehash again for this. There's a whole about 20-page paper I'm going to be submitting with this that everyone's free to look over if they want to see exactly what I found and how I worded everything. And the last thing I'll be going over is the vulnerability ranking system. Just explaining how Greenbone uses or utilizes some open source ranking systems to prioritize and tell you what they think is important for you to fix in your system. All right, executive summary. The task was to perform a vulnerability assessment on partners' computer, not so computer, but servers within your assigned group. Tools to use were both, Greenbone and Nmap or ZenMap, whichever one you're more comfortable with. I use ZenMap myself. The steps we took was access target servers using partner accounts high-level access privileges that they set up for us. Review IP tables for configuration completeness and possible oversights. Ensure app armor is in active status on boot. Probably should have said enabled on boot, but basically when you go to scan a server, you should be able to put in a sudo service app armor status, and it should pop up with the nice green enabled or active line. Utilize Greenbone to perform standard vulnerability assessment. It's actually not too complicated of a system to use. It actually wasn't that painful. I think the nervousness going into not knowing was more painful than the actual doing. Now, being able to explain what each part of everything that I was putting in there for, setting up the profile to scan was, I'm not to that point, but I did get the general gist of target system, scan for a set of common vulnerabilities, and go. My partner only had 3 vulnerabilities and across 2 servers, but I know I also looked at their full report, and there was like 97 reports for all little bitty things that actually weren't vulnerabilities. They could be if you wanted to go minute nitpick, but they weren't vulnerabilities that would lead to anything. So it was actually fairly, I think if you really dug into Greenbone or Nessus or any of them and learned to use them well, I think you could get a lot of good information out of them. We still had good information, but nowhere near as much as we could have. We knew what we were doing. 5, generate report results report. Save it and utilize research identified issues. What were the issues? Why were they caused? How do you fix them? 6, use Nmap, ZenMap, scan for open port configurations. Same thing we've been doing the whole semester. Scan the Windows server, scan the Linux server, make sure it has open ports for SSH and Postgres and POP3S, and then make sure that there's no extra ports open that shouldn't be. So, document results of the issue sort by severity and category. By severity and category, include research and solutions. I think that covers most of the exec summary in a broad term. He did come up with three vulnerabilities. I'll go into the second. Overall, my partner servers were well configured. Just a few low and mid-level vulnerabilities across two servers. Um, Easy to implement fixes, not complicated issues, not stuff you have to tear out whole services and reinstall or reconfigure. And from what I've understood, pretty common um, vulnerabilities that, like I said, the fixes are easy to implement because they're so common, people have just beat them to death. Now, he did have a Postgres vulnerability. Now, that Postgres vulnerability in port 5432, I believe, I'll get to it here in a second, but I think that's the correct port. That may be considered a high priority in certain industries, services, enterprises. If you have something like Qualtrics or Salesforce, where you're pretty much a database centralized and focused, and your whole business is that database, or collection of databases in Salesforce's point there. They make a big deal about what they are, but really they're just a collection of databases and then tools to access and mindsets to be able to deal with the amount of data you get, how to use it correctly. Anyways, I'm going off on a tangent. Anyway, but if you have Salesforce Qualtrics and you have that database, that Postgres issue, and you're using Postgres, that may be considered a high vulnerability, high priority, high criticality. But I'll get into that here in a little bit when I go over the scoring system. All right, the three identified vulnerabilities. Windows, he had one vulnerability, which was a medium priority. It's an HTTPS hypertext transfer protocol secure. It's a weak cipher suite. I'll get into the nitty gritty what it was. It's a fairly common one again. Using a known exploit that's been around for quite some time. Fairly simple just to cut it off. You had Linux first vulnerability was again weak cipher suites. This is port 5432. This is the Postgres one that is medium, but could be considered a high in certain environmental metrics. And then Linux 2 was a general system configuration vulnerability, which is TCP timestamps. Low thing, I mean, it gives them a bit of information that could allow somebody that's really paying attention to uptime of the system using converting timestamps into ticks and then back to actual time. But anyways, this may also be used to, if somebody's really hammering on the system, calculate patch scheduling. And if you're doing packet interception or patch poisoning or something like that, if you got control of or some sort of inroad to the patch supplier, then yeah, that may be an issue. But usually it's just a fairly common issue. You want timestamps because timestamps help the system keep track of sequence numbers, but you don't want your remote users having access to them by including those packets. So that's why that's a vulnerability in the first place. All right, required services. Firewall. You need a Windows Firewall / Defender or IP tables. Windows Firewall is either on or off, and it works or it doesn't. Configured. As far as IP tables is you have greater degree of control. I feel like I'm sure you can have great control over Windows, but I feel like IP tables was once you got familiar with the syntax and a very few set of commands, it was rather intuitive, rather simple. I had one issue that just stumped me for I don't know 2 days, where I just was getting one of my ports that was it was open but not listening basically when I scanned it. Um, it actually was an issue. I just didn't have a general rule to cut off all the other ports, and because I didn't have a general rule and I had that rule, but I didn't have a secondary part of that rule listening. It it sounds complicated, but it's more of a visual thing. I wish I could actually go back and just record me making like the two command changes to fix it and just smacking my head on the table. I'm sure you could have audibly heard it because for 2 days I was stressing when it wasn't anything. but like IP tables now. Used to hate them, like them now. Had to have app armor. That for as far as our required checklist, app armor was Linux only. Um, I'll go into AppArmor here in a second. HTTPS, either using ISS or Apache. POP3S, Linux only using Dovecot. SMTPS using ISS or Postfix. IMAPS using Linux only. Was a Linux only check using Dovecot again. DNS, ISS or Bind, Windows, Linux. Database was a Linux only check using Postgres. SSH was a Linux only check using OpenSSH. Windows kind of had it built in. Really easy to configure once you learned how to do a self-certified certificate, basically. You all could get certificates from a multitude of other places, but Windows had it kind of baked in. Now, when you installed Ubuntu the first time I set up, you had the option to enable SSH. And had you done it like I accidentally did, you would have had it set up the whole time. Like I didn't realize I did and kept freaking out about this open port 22. So when it came time to set it up, it's like, oh, it's set up. So Ubuntu does have that. Also, I believe it has Postgres and Dovecot 1 and 2. I didn't set those up during my initial install. Kind of wish I had. But one of those two is also able to set up with Ubuntu. Then other was a check where to make sure there was no extra ports, and my partner did not have any extra ports he did not need to have open. All right, AppArmor, real quick, just review of AppArmor IP tables. AppArmor is a Linux kernel security module using mandatory access controls. If you were alive and using computers, I was born in the 80s, so in the 90s, early aughts, the early 2000s. XP, loved XP. I understand why they get rid of it, but I kind of wish they would bring the architecture back a little bit. But once we went from XP to 2000 and then Windows 7, mandatory access control were my bane, especially if you were a gamer and you like modding or playing with your game files or just installing, uninstalling. I hated mandatory access controls. They were just annoying. And I was in Korea and the internet wasn't always great, and trying to get around them and get files, and mods for my games was already headache enough. Also, Iraq and Afghanistan, mandatory access control, I used to hate them. Anyways, but they are an important security tool. So back on, off the tangent again. AppArmor Linux kernel security modules using mandatory access controls. It's a Debian-based command line interface. Before I started cybersecurity, I hated command line. Now I don't love it, but I can deal with it. I'm especially more familiar with Linux architecture and file system and how to figure out where stuff is. I still have a problem if I mess something up, about to say a bad word, if I mess something up, how to fix it, because that can be annoying in Linux when you don't have, I can just, Linux, I can just click on my files and say, oh, I messed this one up, get rid of it. But anyways, AppArmor is an alternative to SC Linux. It's used to restrict access to certain applications, scripts, programs to perform certain functions through profiles by defining resource use and privileges. It's pre-installed in Ubuntu by default because Ubuntu does not have access to SC Linux. Now, it's got 3 modes: enforce, which is active protection; complain, which is used for debugging, to tell you when something's wrong. When I stop something unconfined means that there's no profile set up for that service. IP tables, utility program allows a system admin to configure IP packet filtering for the Linux kernel. Filters are based on tables with rule chains. Perform the same task as Windows Defender for Linux. Filtering based on task chains, rules, and targets. And for default tables, filter network address translation, mangle and raw. So, alright, fixes for identified vulnerabilities. First of all, I will not be putting in step-by-step instructions because this thing will be 20 pages longer than it needs to be. Like I said before, I have a nice 20-page report I'm submitting. If you want it, I'll send it to you. It's got all the same instructions. Or if you go to the sources listed in this video, and you can get the exact same instructions I put in the paper. So I'm just going to go over what I found in the general solution. All right, now Windows Vulnerability 1, the only vulnerability it had for my partner server was weak cyber suites for HTTPS. This vulnerability allowed for 3DS cipher suite access was specifically vulnerable to the Suite 32 exploit. What's the Suite 32 exploits? It lists the birthday attacks, 364 blockchain ciphers. It basically runs Java via browser and sends increasing levels of traffic until there's a data collision, and then it shifts the information to find more information, usually looking for stuff like session cookies. Solution. Um, like I said, all his issues had easy solutions. This one was disable TLS1 and 1.1, which unless you have a reason, you shouldn't be running them anyways. They're outdated, they're old, they're probably already cracked. Just stop doing it. Use TLS 1.2, and then you can blacklist a weak cipher for TLS 1.2. And this is all done via PowerShell command. Like I said, it's in my sources. I think it's the very first source with that address, or you can, like I said, I'll send you my paper. Okay, this is the third time I've had to record the slide because I keep putting my finger on the mouse and scrolling the mouse wheel up and down, which messes up my whole thing. So try this one more time. Linux vulnerability 1. This is a weak cipher suites for port 5432. This is the Postgres vulnerability I talked about. Could be higher based on environmental scores, which I'll get into when I get to the vulnerability ranking system. Now, the weak cipher suites identifies the TLS RSA with seed CBC SHA cipher suite as a vulnerability. What is this? This is a 128 symmetric cipher suite split into 264 blocks using the RSA and seed. I can't speak now. Why is this a problem? Now, seed RSA, of course, is a 2056 standard. Seed is still being, it was created in Korea back in 05. It's still being updated with NIST standards. Even as late as I think November 2021, I saw a update that mentioned the seed cipher suite. This particular suite here, in general, this one was one of the original ones when they combined RSA with seed. It was created in 2005. It's old. It's symmetric, and it's 128-bit, but it's split into 264 blocks, so it's pre-broken into smaller blocks. So all this means that probably don't want to use it. It makes a really enticing target, especially versus progressing and more commonly the 256-bit encryption that is becoming more common. So simple solution: sudo nano either the userlib SSL or the userlib SSL and the Apache 2 sites available configuration files, and both of them are saying you amend a list of ciphers you want to use, and then it excludes everything else. It won't use anything else once you amend those lines with the approved cipher list. With the Apache 2 SSL, you're also going to want to cut off SSL v3, SSL v2, TLS 1.0, TLS 1.1. Shouldn't be using them anyways. Now, the Linux 2 TCP timestamps. This vulnerability is a general vulnerability. It's a system configuration vulnerability. It's basically allowed a remote user to view and access TCP timestamps. It can be used to calculate server uptime, patching schedule. It's a smaller vulnerability. It's a low priority. It's not considered a big thing. TCP timestamps help the system keep track of sequence numbers. But if you have somebody that's really watching, they could take a couple of packets worth of timestamps and take those timestamps, convert those into ticks, and that in real time, and they could calculate server uptime and patching schedule. If they have access to a patching source for something, then they can do a packet poisoning or something like that. But usually this is a low priority vulnerability. That's really simple. Sudo nano. I don't off the top of my head, but that's the system control configuration file. Just amend that and add in the net.ipv4.tcp timestamp equals 0. Just shuts them off. So easy fix. Vulnerability ranking system. Okay, how does Greenbone go about ranking vulnerabilities? It uses the common vulnerability scoring system with CVSS. It uses a complicated scoring algorithm that models. When I looked at it, it really reminded me of how now when I started doing cybersecurity, one of my first professors was Dr. Shinlo Mamet. He came up with one of the leading cyber risk management suites. His whole life has been to not just qualify but quantifying risk, especially when it comes to cybersecurity for Turkey. One of the leading researchers in the field. Great guy. And when I looked at this CVSS, it really did remind me of Clearwater or Cyber Risk Solver when it comes to risk management framework with the time to failure scoring. It kind of bases it off that. Now, it's got 6 vectors across 2 metrics. 2 metrics are base and impact. There's also 2 more metrics, but we'll get into that in a second. So, 6 vectors are access control, access complexity, and authentication. Then it goes to impact is the CIA triangle of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, having said all that, what does it do with this? Well, first it gets a base criticality score. Exploitability is 20 times your access vector. Your access complexity, authentication. Get your impact. Get your function of impact. And get your base score right there. Then that base score is combined with temporal, which is time-based evolution, threat evolution factors, and environmental metrics, which comes to that Postgres vulnerability I talked about. The environmental score for that Postgres vulnerability in a position like Salesforce or Qualtrics or any big business that's totally based off a Postgres database is going to be much higher, which is going to raise the score on that. But like I said, you take those just that base score, you combine it with temporal environmental metrics, it spits out another big number. So that's the Cliff Notes version. I'm already at 21 minutes. I need to wrap this up. Here's the sources. Like I said, the first source is all the PowerShell commands. The Google source there is the CVSS scoring system. If you want to really dig into how that scoring system works, and the minutia of it is right there. Seed ciphers goes on to a lot of the the RSA with seed vulnerability, SSL cipher hardening. A lot of good resource here. So, all right, anybody who's been with me this far through this class, I appreciate. It's been headaches, been stressful, but we're done. Now it's just a matter of putting everything in and seeing where I end up. So, have fun.